The radio call came in at 11:47 p.m. Military aircraft down. 3 miles out. Multiple casualties. Survivors unknown. Every doctor in the ear of Harlow General Center straightened up. Every resident grabbed a chart. Every attending physician moved toward the trauma bays with purpose, with authority, with the casual confidence of people who believed they were the most important people in the room. Nobody looked at the nurse in Bay 4. Nobody ever looked at Mara Sloane. She was 32 years old, blonde, quiet, and walked with a limp that got worse when the weather turned cold. She had spent 6 months on the night shift, being talked over, talked around, and talked down to. She had a habit of standing slightly behind everyone else, speaking only when directly asked, of disappearing so completely into the background that most of the senior staff had stopped registering her as a full person. When the first military transport screamed into the parking lot and the back doors flew open, every eye in that ER turned toward Dr. Felix Drayton, the chief of emergency medicine, who was already pulling on gloves and issuing orders. Nobody saw Mara Sloane stop moving. Nobody saw her close her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Nobody saw what happened to her face when she did. Before we get into this story, if you're watching this for the first time, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Every week we bring you stories like this one, raw, cinematic, and built to hit hard. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. 6 months earlier, Mara Sloane had taken the job at Harlow General because it was the only ER in Raleigh that wasn't asking too many questions. That was how she thought about it. Not the only one hiring, not the most convenient commute, the only one not asking too many questions. She had filled out the application on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in a rental car outside a storage unit where she kept 2 duffel bags and a folding cot she had never unfolded. She had listed her nursing license, her certifications, her 5 years of documented civilian and clinical experience, and she had left the military service section blank. Not falsified. Blank. The HR coordinator who processed her paperwork had looked at the gap and shrugged. Prior employer references? Previous role was federal. Some of the documentation is restricted. The HR coordinator had typed something into her computer, stamped something onto a form, and slid a packet across the desk. Night shift, 12-hour rotations. You'll report to charge Nurse Deanna Voss. That had been October. By April, Mara had learned every inch of the night shift ER, every attending physician's preferred supply arrangement, every equipment quirk in each of the 6 trauma bays. She knew which monitors ran 5 seconds slow. She knew that Bay 2 had a suction unit that needed a hard reset if it hadn't been used in more than 8 hours. She knew that the crash cart near the nurse's station had a defibrillator that worked fine, but sounded like it was struggling even when it wasn't, which caused 2 separate to hesitate during simulations. She had quietly reported all of this to Deanna Voss, who had nodded and done nothing. She had reported the defibrillator issue twice more, in writing, and nothing had happened. So she had started keeping a notebook. The notebook was spiral-bound, dark green, the same kind she had carried in the field. She documented supply discrepancies, equipment irregularities, protocol deviations, and the 17 separate occasions in 6 months when a patient had been moved through triage faster or slower, based on factors that had nothing to do with clinical priority. She didn't do anything with the notebook yet. She was still learning the shape of this place, still figuring out where the pressure points were, which complaints would go, where, which chain of reporting was functional, and which was theater. In the meantime, she did her job. She did it without comment, without complaint, and without ever letting anyone see how much she actually knew. This was not humility. It was strategy, though she would not have called it that. It was closer to what happens when a person has spent enough time in environments where being underestimated was an asset, where the safest thing you could be was the one nobody was watching. The problem with Harlow General was that the person who most aggressively did not watch her was Felix Drayton. Dr. Drayton was 47 tall, with the kind of silver at his temples that photographed well and that he was aware of. He had been chief of emergency medicine for 6 years. He had strong opinions about hierarchy, about the appropriate scope of nursing roles, and about the kind of professional orders, and about the kind of professional order that he felt was slipping in American medicine generally. He said things like scope, creep, the way other people said profanity with disgust and a little bit of relish. He had taken a dislike to Mara within the first 2 weeks, though he would not have been able to articulate exactly why. It was something about the way she moved, the way she watched, the quality of stillness she had, that read to him as either blankness or arrogance, and he had decided early that it was arrogance. Carter, he had said once, 2 months in, calling her by the wrong name in front of the entire shift. "What's the GCS on the patient in for?" "Sloane," she had said. "Mara Sloane. GCS is 11. Motor response is 4. Verbal is 3. Eye-opening is 4. BP is dropping, 90/60 and trending. He needs imaging." Drayton had looked at her for a moment, the way people look at something that surprised them and that they resent for surprising them. "I'll assess when I assess," he had said, and walked away. The patient in Bay 4 had been transferred to the ICU 20 minutes later with a subdural hematoma that the attending had initially missed. Mara had documented it. She documented everything. By February, she was documenting 2 or 3 incidents per week. By March, the notebook was 3/4 full. She had started a second one in a drawer at home, a more organized version, with dates and patient identifier numbers, redacted to protect confidentiality, but with clinical detail precise enough that anyone who knew what they were reading would understand exactly what was happening in this ER. Nobody at Harlow General knew what she was reading. That was fine. She wasn't ready yet. The incidents that changed the shape of things started, like most things in an ER, without any warning. It was a Wednesday night in April, just past 10 o'clock, and the department was running at about 70% capacity. Busy, but not overwhelmed. Mara was in the process of discharging a patient from Bay 6 when she heard raised voices from the other side of the department. She finished the discharge documentation, walked the patient to the exit, and came back to find a cluster of staff around Bay 3. Drayton was in the center of it, which was typical. What was less typical was the expression on the face of the resident beside him, a second-year named Dr. Patel, who was 27 years old and had not yet learned to hide what he was thinking. He was thinking that something was wrong. Mara walked closer. The patient in Bay 3 was a 24-year-old male, construction, accident, head laceration, and suspected broken arm. He had been triaged, cleaned up, and was waiting for imaging results. On paper, he was stable. Looking at him, Mara felt something change in her chest. The particular quality of wrongness that she had learned to identify. Before, she could name it in field conditions, in forward operating bases, in places where the monitors were worse, and the lighting was worse, and the margin for error was much smaller than this. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the patient's color. She looked at the way he was breathing, the subtle asymmetry, the faint compensatory effort on one side. She stepped forward. Dr. Patel. Patel looked at her. Drayton did not. "His breath sounds are unequal," she said quietly. "Left side is diminished." Drayton turned then. "Excuse me?" "I said his breath sounds are unequal. He may have a pneumothorax developing. The imaging results will be here when they're here, and we will make a clinical determination at that time." Drayton's voice was the flat, final kind. "You are the night shift nurse assigned to Bay 6. You are not assigned to this bay, and you are not a physician." "I'm aware of that." "Then return to your assignment." Mara looked at the patient. She looked at the monitor. The oxygen saturation was 92% and had been there for 4 minutes. That wasn't catastrophic. It was the trend that mattered, the direction, the rate, the pattern. She had seen this before. She had seen what came next. The SAT is 92 and declining, she said. He was at 96 on intake. The fall is accelerating. Nurse Sloane. Drayton's voice went to a different register, the one that was meant to end conversations. I will report you to the charge nurse for interfering with an active clinical assessment. Go back to Bay 6. She went back to Bay 6. She stood at the edge of Bay 6 with her back to the wall and watched the monitor in Bay 3 through the glass. 91%. 90. 88. When the alarm triggered, she was already moving. Patel was the one who reacted correctly. He called for the chest tray and started positioning the patient, hands moving with the kind of controlled speed that meant he had already been worried. Drayton was issuing orders in his command voice, the one that covered uncertainty with volume. By the time Mara reached the bay, Patel had the needle decompression set open and was reading the patient's side. 2 centimeters below the clavicle, she said, moving to the opposite side of the bed. Midclavicular line, second intercostal space. He's compensating right, so it's left tension. Patel inserted the needle. There was the sound, the specific, unmistakable hiss of pressure releasing, and the patient's oxygen saturation began climbing within seconds. 90, 93, 96. The room let out a breath. Patel looked up at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Drayton said, "Get out of this bay." His voice was different now. Quieter. The kind of quiet that isn't calm. Mara walked out of the bay. She went to the staff restroom, ran cold water over her hands, and stood over the sink for a moment, looking at her own face in the mirror. She looked, she had been told, like someone who had gotten very good at not showing things. She thought that was about right. She dried her hands and went back to work. Drayton filed a formal complaint against her at 11:15 that night. She was notified via the hospital's internal messaging system at 11:42 while she was changing a wound, dressing in Bay 2. The complaint cited unauthorized interference with active patient care, failure to follow direct physician instruction, and pattern of behavior inconsistent with assigned nursing role. She read the notification, finished the dressing, properly logged the care, and went on with her shift. In the morning, she added everything to the second notebook. The formal review meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. It was held in a conference room on the administrative floor with the kind of lighting that was designed for PowerPoint presentations, and that made everyone look slightly wrong. Present were Drayton, the hospital's risk management director, a woman named Sylvia Park, the head of nursing, whose name was Robert Fielding, and Deanna Voss, who sat at the far end of the table and looked at her hands. Mara sat alone on one side of the table. She had brought no documentation. She had her notebook, but she left it in her bag. Park opened the meeting with a summary of the complaint and then looked at Mara in the particular way administrators look at people they have already decided about. We want to give you an opportunity to respond, but I want to be clear, we take physician authority in clinical settings very seriously. So do I, Mara said. Dr. Drayton's account indicates you repeatedly disregarded his direct instructions. I documented my clinical observations to the attending physician and to a second physician who was present. When the patient's condition deteriorated in line with my assessment, I provided assistance that was requested by the treating resident. Dr. Patel has not confirmed that request. Mara looked at Patel's empty chair. He had not been invited to the meeting. She noted that. The patient's SAT was at 88% when I re-entered the bay, she said. He was developing a tension pneumothorax. Dr. Patel performed the needle decompression successfully. The patient recovered. The concern, Park said, is not the outcome. The concern is the conduct. This was the sentence Mara had been waiting for. She had heard variations of it before. In different rooms, with different titles across the table, with different language around it, but the same sentence. The concern is not what happened. The concern is that you did it. I understand, she said. Drayton leaned forward. You have a pattern of overstepping. You've been corrected for it. You continue to do it. That's not a clinical instinct. That's a discipline problem. Mara looked at him. What would you have wanted me to do differently? She asked. Follow instructions. The patient would have died. That is a clinical determination for the physician in charge to make, not for a nurse who's been on staff for 6 months and who has a history of... He stopped. She waited. A history of what? She asked. He didn't finish the sentence, which told her he had been asking about her, had found something incomplete, and had chosen not to name the gap because he didn't know what was in it. The decision, Park said, is that we are placing a formal written warning in your file and requiring you to complete additional training on professional conduct and scope of nursing practice. Any further incidents will be grounds for termination. Mara sat with this for a moment. Noted, she said. She picked up her bag, stood, and walked out. In the elevator going down, she thought about the patient in Bay 3. She thought about the sound of the pressure releasing. She thought about Patel's hands moving correctly, the decision to act coming from somewhere steady inside him, despite the noise around it. She thought, 3 months, maybe 4. Then she'd have what she needed. The 6 weeks after the meeting were the worst stretch of her time at Harlow General, but not because anything dramatic happened. Nothing dramatic happened. It was quieter in the specific way that quiet becomes its own kind of pressure. Staff who had been neutral before moved slightly away. Deanna Voss stopped making eye contact. A traveling nurse named Patricia, who had been friendly in the break room, began choosing different break times. Drayton didn't say anything directly. He didn't need to. The written warning was in her file, which meant every attending in the department knew it existed, which meant the social geometry of the ER had shifted around her without anyone acknowledging the shift. Mara worked her shifts. She kept her head down. She filled the second notebook. She had dinner alone 3 nights a week at a diner 7 blocks from her apartment, a booth in the back, coffee, whatever the special was. She read. She slept. She ran in the mornings, despite the limp, which was worse on cold days, and which she had stopped explaining to anyone who asked because the explanation was too long and required too much context. The limp came from shrapnel. 3 pieces, 2 removed, 1 left in place. The one left in place sat approximately 4 centimeters from her femoral nerve, which meant the weather didn't change how much was in there, but did change how much she felt it. Cold made the surrounding tissue contract. That was all. It was manageable. It had always been manageable. She had been managing it for 3 years. The apartment was functional, a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and old radiators. She had a bed, a table, a chair, and a bookshelf with 6 books on it that she had read multiple times. She had a plant on the windowsill that she watered every 5 days with the same regularity she applied to everything else. The plant was doing well. She was doing well enough. The night everything changed was the last Thursday in April. She was in the middle of a standard 12-hour shift. Nothing unusual about the first 8 hours, which had involved 2 cardiac presentations, 1 pediatric respiratory case, a significant laceration from a woodworking accident, and the ordinary low-grade chaos of a regional ER in a mid-sized city on a weeknight. At 11:33 p.m., the department radio lit up. It was the frequency that Harlow General shared with the County Emergency Management System, not the channel they used for ambulance dispatch, but the secondary channel that almost nobody monitored during normal operations. Mara monitored it. She had been monitoring it since her 2nd week, because in a border county with 2 active military installations within 30 miles, the secondary channel occasionally carried information that mattered before the primary channel caught up. She heard the transmission before the charge desk did. Military aircraft, mechanical failure, Crash site 3 miles east. At least 4 personnel. Condition of pilot unknown. ETA for first transport approximately 9 minutes. She looked at the clock. She looked at the department. She looked at the trauma bays. Bay 1 was occupied, unstable patient. Bay 2 was occupied, stable patient currently awaiting imaging. Bays 3 and 4 were clear. Bay 5 had a resident in it, finishing discharge paperwork. Bay 6 was clear. She walked to the supply station and began quietly pulling trauma supplies, chest trays, surgical packs, decompression kits, additional IV lines, blood draw kits, type and cross tubes. She was not the most senior nurse on the floor. She had no authority to configure the bays. She configured bays 3, 4, and 6 anyway, working quickly and without drawing attention, and was back at her station when the charge desk picked up the radio call, and Drayton's voice came over the department intercom announcing incoming mass casualty. By the time the trauma team had assembled and was moving, the 3 bays were already prepared. Nobody noticed. Nobody was looking at her. 4 minutes later, the first transport arrived. The vehicle that came through the ambulance bay was not a standard ambulance. It was a tactical medical vehicle, black, no markings, with personnel and equipment that was not standard emergency medical services gear. The people moving alongside the stretcher were not paramedics. Mara recognized the equipment. She recognized the movement patterns. She moved toward the bay. The first patient was a young man, early 20s, in military-issue clothing, with blast injury patterning across his left side, the specific distribution that meant proximity to a detonation. Though this was supposedly a mechanical crash, which meant something about the nature of the incident was being managed carefully, even in how it was being described. Drayton moved in. What do we have? The medical technician, because that's what he was, not a paramedic, gave a rapid report. GSW ruled out. Blast pattern, left side. BP 104/70. Tachycardic at 118. Oxygen saturation 94 on 5 liters. Get him onto the monitor and start a second line, Drayton said. Mara was already on the monitor. She was already starting the second line. She had his arm, the tourniquet set, the catheter ready. She looked at his chest while she worked. The blast patterning was left-sided, but the breathing asymmetry was right-sided. She watched him take 3 breaths, watched the intercostal muscles on the right work, slightly harder than the left. Watched the subtle shift in tracheal position that would be invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. She looked at Drayton. He has a tension building on the right. The blast is left, but the mechanism could have. He's on 94 and holding. Sloane. Start the line and stop editorializing. She started the line. The second and third patients arrived nearly simultaneously, 2 more military personnel. Different injury patterns, both critical but in different ways. The ER fractured into organized motion, residents and attendings peeling off to different bays, the charge nurse coordinating from the center of the floor. Mara kept watching her patient. 94, 93, 92. She finished the IV line. She drew blood for the type and cross. She adjusted the oxygen flow and rechecked the monitor. 91. Dr. Drayton. Her voice was even. SAT is at 91 and dropping. Right-sided tension pattern, I need you to. Sloane. I have 3 critical patients and I don't need a running commentary from my... The alarm went off. 88%. Heart rate spiking to 140. The patient's hand found her wrist. Not a grab a grip. His eyes were open, focused, showing the particular kind of fear that wasn't panic, but recognition. He knew what was happening to him. She looked at him. I've got you. She looked at Drayton. Move, she said. It was one word. The same word, the same register, the same precise volume she had used in forward operating bases, in places she didn't say out loud anymore, in field conditions with equipment that cost a fraction of what was in this bay, in the dark, in the cold, with people depending on her to be the calmest person in the room. Drayton stared at her. Move, she said again, or he dies. She didn't wait for him to decide. She had the chest tray open. She had the needle in her hand. She placed her fingers on his chest, found the landmark, found the angle, and decompressed the tension pneumothorax with the clean, practiced efficiency of someone who had done this more times than she had ever told anyone in this building. The hiss of released pressure filled the bay. The alarm began to quiet. 88, 91, 94, 96. The patient's grip on her wrist loosened. His breathing changed deeper, both sides now even. His color came back. She watched the monitor and counted 15 seconds without moving, because that was what you did. That was the discipline of it. You did not celebrate until you had counted 15 seconds and the number was still climbing. 97. She stepped back. The ER was very quiet around her. Drayton had not moved. Patel, who had appeared from somewhere and was now standing at the edge of the bay, had not moved. Nobody in the room had moved. Then the second vehicle came through the doors. Not a tactical transport this time. Something larger, heavier. She heard it before she saw it. The particular sound of the doors, the number of footsteps, the controlled urgency and voices that were trying to be quieter than the situation warranted. She looked towards the entrance. 4 individuals in military equipment came through the doors. Not medical technicians. Security details, that was what they were, in the specific way that people who were very serious about keeping someone alive moved around that person. They were surrounding a stretcher. The man on the stretcher was older, 55, maybe 60, in civilian clothes that had been cut away at the left side to expose injury, gray at the temples, a face that, even in the current condition, had the specific gravity of someone who was used to rooms rearranging themselves around his arrival. She did not recognize his face, but one of the men in his security detail recognized her. He came through the door, and he saw her, and he stopped walking for exactly 1 step. His name was Sergeant First Class Dominic Reese, and the last time she had seen him, he had been bleeding from a scalp laceration in a field position 3 years ago, and she had been the one to close it. He stared at her. She held very still. Captain Sloane? The bay had already been quiet. Now it was the kind of quiet that happens when everyone simultaneously understands that something is happening that they don't have the full context for. She looked at him. Her voice was steady. "I'm not a captain anymore, Sergeant Reese." His jaw moved. He looked at the man on the stretcher. He looked back at her. "He asked for you," he said. 40 minutes ago, when he was still conscious, he told us the name of the nurse on night shift at Harlow General. She felt something shift in the room. She felt every pair of eyes move to her. Drayton's voice came from behind her. "What is this?" She didn't answer. She was looking at the man on the stretcher, whose eyes had opened barely, fighting through what was clearly serious blood loss and probable hemorrhagic shock, and who was looking back at her with the particular expression of someone who had not expected to see a specific face and was seeing it anyway, and was choosing to interpret this as something other than coincidence. His lips moved. She stepped forward and leaned in close enough to hear. He said one word. She straightened up. She turned to the trauma team behind her, and her voice was the same voice she had used in the field, not loud, not aggressive, not asking permission. "He has a penetrating cardiac injury, the left ventricle. If you don't open that chest in the next 4 minutes, he is going to die on this table." Drayton's voice, that's a presumptive diagnosis based on... "It's not presumptive," she said. "Look at his neck veins. Look at his pressure. What is it?" The technician from the transport, 70/40 and dropping. "Muffled heart sounds," she said. "Distended neck veins. Hypotension. That's Beck's triad. His cardiac tamponade. If you don't decompress the pericardium right now, you will lose him." The room held for 2 seconds. Patel moved first. He called for the thoracic tray, called for the cardiac surgeon on call, called for OR to clear a room. Drayton hadn't moved. Mara was already at the patient's side. And for the first time in 6 months, since she had walked into this building with her blank application and her dark green notebook and her plan to disappear completely until the right moment the entire emergency department of Harlow General Medical Center was watching Marcia Sloane. The patient's eyes found her again. She looked back at him. She did not know, yet, exactly who he was. She did not know what his rank was, what his title was, what his name meant to the people in this building, and the people who would be notified within the hour. She would know all of that soon enough. What she knew right now was that he had 4 minutes. She snapped on her gloves. She snapped on her gloves and moved to the head of the stretcher, repositioning herself with the kind of efficiency that didn't announce itself, no wasted motion, no performance of urgency, just the immediate physical logic of someone who had done emergency thoracic intervention in worse conditions than this, and had learned that the margin between alive and not alive was almost always measured in seconds, not minutes. "I need a pericardiocentesis tray," she said. 18-gauge needle, 60cc syringe, 3-way stopcock. Now, the trauma tech, a young man named Garrett who had been standing at the supply cart trying to figure out what was happening, moved without questioning her. That was something. That was the ER working the way it was supposed to work, which was everyone responding to the clearest voice in the room. Drayton stepped forward. "Sloane, you do not have the authority to order." "Then order it yourself," she said, without looking at him. "But order it in the next 60 seconds, or I'm doing this without the kit." The monitor on the stretcher showed 62/38. Heart rate 152 and irregular. Garrett handed her the tray. She looked at Dr. Patel. He was at the foot of the stretcher, gloved, watching her with an expression so that it was past the point of institutional hesitation. He was in the clinical moment now, not the political one. "I'll talk you through it if you want to do the stick," she said. Patel shook his head once. "You've done this before." She had done this before. 7 times. One of those had been in near-complete darkness, on a medevac floor, with the aircraft moving. She did not say any of this. She uncapped the needle, cleaned the subxiphoid area with the iodine swabs Garrett had ready, and positioned the angle 45 degrees toward the left shoulder, the approach that gave the best trajectory to the pericardial space in a patient with the build and injury presentation she was working with. She felt the resistance, then the give. Felt the needle enter the space. She drew back on the syringe. Dark blood, not the bright red of arterial, but the darker venous blood of pericardial tamponade, the blood that had been compressing the heart from outside, preventing it from filling, from pumping, from doing the one thing it needed to do. She drew 30 cc. The monitor changed. Heart rate dropped not to normal, not yet, but from 152 to 131. The pressure, 78/52. She drew another 20 cc. 91/60. Heart rate 118. The security detail hadn't moved. Sergeant Reese was standing 2 feet from the foot of the stretcher with his hands at his sides and the kind of expression that meant he was holding everything very still inside. "He needs ore," she said. "The tamponade is relieved temporarily, but the underlying injury needs repair. Where is cardiac surgery?" "Patel, Dr. Arnstein is scrubbing. Ore 2 is clearing. He needs to be moving in 4 minutes." She looked at the patient. His eyes were open again. He was breathing both sides, more evenly, now that the pressure on his heart had eased. His color was still wrong, still the grayish pale of someone who had lost significant blood volume. But he was present. He was in the room with her in a way he hadn't been 60 seconds ago. His lips moved. She leaned in. His voice was barely there. Hoarse, effortful, the voice of someone working very hard to produce sound. He said, "Still the best hands in the theater." She straightened up. Something happened in her chest brief, contained the kind of feeling she had learned to process in real time, without letting it alter anything she was doing. She had learned that in the field. You felt the thing, and you kept working. Feeling and working were not mutually exclusive. People thought they were. They were wrong. Theater's a little nicer, she said. Don't talk. He closed his eyes. She looked at Reese. Who is he? Reese looked at her for a moment. It was the look of someone calculating what he was allowed to say, weighing protocols and the immediate reality in front of him. Brigadier General Warren Cade, he said. Deputy Commander, 3rd Medical Command. She filed that. She'd process the implications later. Is the crash site secure? Working on it. Are there more casualties coming to this facility? One more. Should be here in about 12 minutes. Less critical? She nodded. She stripped her gloves, grabbed a fresh pair, and turned to take stock of the rest of the department. The 3 other patients from the crash were distributed across bays 3, 4, and 6. Drayton was in bay 4. 2 residents she recognized were managing bay 3. Bay 6 had the least critical patients, still urgent, still needed monitoring, but not immediately dying. She moved to bay 3 first because the resident in there, a first year, named Dr. Olu Adeyemi, had been on the floor for 4 months and was excellent at following procedure and weak at the moments when procedure ran out of answers. She looked at the patient, mid-30s, male, burn pattern on both hands, and left forearm consistent with flash burn. No full thickness involvement visible, but the face was wrong. The eyes were wrong. Has anyone assessed for blast concussion? She asked. Adeyemi looked at her. The burns are the primarians. His eyes aren't tracking together, she said. Look at his left pupil. She took a pen light from her pocket and leaned in. Reactive but sluggish on the left. He may have an intracranial pressure issue concurrent with the burns. She watched Adeyemi absorb this, recalibrate, pull his ophthalmoscope, and start the full neuro check. He was good at absorbing. She had noticed that about him early. Get neuro down here, she told him. Tell them you have a possible blast TBI concurrent with burn injury, possible ICP elevation. Don't let them push you to tomorrow morning. She moved to bay 6. The patient there was a woman, younger, maybe 19 or 20, also in military gear, with a fractured radius and a significant contusion across her left side. The fracture was the obvious injury, which meant it was probably not the only injury. Her urine output? She asked the nurse. Managing the bay, a travel nurse named Brenda, who was competent but had never worked military casualties before. We haven't cathed her yet. Catheterize her and watch the output. With this mechanism, she may have renal involvement. And look at her left flank. That contusion pattern could be a splenic lac. Brenda was already moving. Mara turned around. Drayton was standing 10 feet away, watching her. She met his gaze. He looked for the first time in 6 months, like someone who did not know exactly what to say next. That was new. He always knew what to say. Next, that was the architecture of how he operated, the constant maintenance of verbal authority, the ability to speak into any space and fill it with his own certainty. She had watched him do it for 6 months. He didn't do it now. She walked past him toward the nurse's station. The next 40 minutes were controlled chaos of the particular variety that a well-functioning ER can metabolize, not calm, but organize turbulence, everyone moving with purpose, the department flexing the way it was supposed to flex. General Cade went to OR 2 at 12. 11 a.m. Dr. Arnstein, the cardiac surgeon, a compact, precise woman in her 50s who said almost nothing and did everything correctly, had gotten the report from Patel on the way up and was apparently satisfied with the pericardiocentesis because she didn't comment on it, which in Mara's experience was as close to a compliment as surgeons of that type gave. The 4th patient arrived at 12, 23, a male staff sergeant, mid-40s, with a shoulder dislocation, 3 broken ribs, and a laceration that needed 50-something stitches but would not kill him. He was the most ambulatory of the group and the most talkative, which was both useful and occasionally in the way. Reese stayed on the floor. He had positioned himself near the nurse's station, which was the closest thing to a central oversight point, and he was watching everything with the practiced stillness of someone trained to observe without being in the way. Around 1 in the morning, when the immediate critical phase had resolved and the department had moved into the sustained monitoring phase, he appeared beside her at the medication cart. "Captain Sloane, I told you. Not anymore. You want me to call you something else?" She was drawing up a medication for the burn patient's pain management. "Mara is fine." He was quiet for a moment. She had always appreciated that about him, the ability to be quiet without it being a statement. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 6 months. "You working the whole time?" "Yes." He didn't ask why she hadn't called anyone. He probably already knew, or could piece it together from what he'd seen tonight. "He knew you were here," Reese said. "General Cade. He told me about a month ago, said he'd heard you transferred to civilian nursing in Raleigh. Said if we ever had a casualty in this area, he wanted us to know what hospital you were at." She finished drawing the medication. "That's not how that's supposed to work." "No," Reese agreed. "It's not." She capped the syringe. "He's going to be all right. Arnstein is excellent." "I know." She looked at him. He was maybe 40, now older than she remembered, though she had last seen him under circumstances that didn't encourage detailed observation of faces. There was gray in his beard that hadn't been there before. Above his left ear from the laceration she'd closed was still visible if you knew where to look. "What really happened tonight?" she asked. "The crash." Reese's expression didn't change, which was its own answer. "I mean the mechanism," she said. "The blast pattern on my first patient was inconsistent with a standard mechanical failure. Investigation is ongoing." "Right." She picked up her tray. "Keep me posted." She was 3 steps away when he said, "There are going to be people here in the morning. J. Egg, probably. Medical Command Liaison. They're going to have questions about tonight." She stopped. She didn't turn around. "I've answered questions before," she said. She kept walking. The shift ended at 7. Technically. In practice, she stayed until 9:15 because the documentation load from a mass casualty event doesn't respect shift change, and because she was the primary nurse of record on General Cade's initial trauma intervention, and the chart needed to be complete and unambiguous before she left it. She was at the nurse's station, finishing the last section of the chart when Drayton walked in. He hadn't left either. She had noticed him on the floor periodically throughout the night, not managing patients, mostly, but present in the way that administrators are present after something significant happens, moving through the space with an energy that was assessing, calibrating, figuring out what the event meant for the version of things he needed to be true. He stood beside the station. He didn't sit. "You need to understand something," he said. "What happened tonight, what you did, is not going to just go away because the patient survived." She kept typing. "The written warning is still in your file. The interventions you performed tonight were outside your nursing scope. The fact that they were clinically successful doesn't change the regulatory reality." She saved the chart section she'd been working on and looked at him. "I performed a pericardiocentesis on a patient in hemorrhagic shock with Beck's triad presentation, who had no physician immediately ready to perform the procedure," she said. "The patients survived. His cardiac surgeon noted the intervention in her OR notes and did not flag it as contraindicated. Dr. Arnstein is a surgeon. She's not a nursing scope compliance officer. No. She's the person who kept General Cade alive after I bought him time to get to her table." She paused. "What would you have done differently?" It was the same question she had asked in the conference room. She asked it the same way, not as a challenge exactly, but not as a genuine inquiry either. Like placing something on the table between them and watching what he did with it. Drayton's jaw tightened. "You'd better get a lawyer." "Why?" "Because I'm filing an incident report this morning and recommending a formal nursing board review of your actions last night. You don't have the credentials to do what you did." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the notebook. The green one, the organized one, with the dates and the case numbers and the patient outcomes and the 17 instances of triaging by preference rather than acuity. She thought about the formal complaint he had filed in the system, about the Bay 3 patient 6 weeks ago, and about the note she'd written to herself at the bottom of the relevant page. He'll do it again. You should know, she said, that my documentation of General Cade's care is complete, time-stamped, and clinically detailed. Dr. Patel was present for the intervention. Sergeant Reese was present. 2 trauma techs were present. Whatever report you file will be filed against a documented record. Drayton said nothing. I'd also suggest, she said, that before you file a nursing board complaint against the person who kept the deputy commander of 3rd Medical Command alive last night, you think carefully about who's going to be asked to review that complaint and what they're going to know by then. She saved the chart, closed the tab, and picked up her bag. Drayton's voice stopped her before she reached the door. What are you? He said. It wasn't an insult. She recognized this genuine confusion. The kind that happened when a person's model of the world turned out to be missing a significant piece of information. She considered the question. I'm a nurse, she said. Night shift, Bay 6. She walked out. She slept 4 hours, which was usually enough. When she woke, her phone had 11 messages. 3 from numbers she didn't recognize. 1 from Deanna Voss, which she had never received before in 6 months of working the same shift. 1 from a contact listed in her phone only by initials W. K, which was not a contact she had called in over 2 years and whose existence in her phone she had kept because deleting it had always felt like a decision she might regret. She didn't open any of them immediately. She made coffee. She looked at the plant on the windowsill, which was doing fine. She drank half the coffee, standing at the kitchen counter, looking at nothing in particular. Then she opened the message from WK. It was 2 sentences. Heard you were the one. Thank you. More soon. She set the phone down. She picked up her coffee. She stood there for a while. The message from Deanna Voss was a request to come in for a meeting with hospital administration at 2 p.m. The phrasing was careful, not a disciplinary summons, not a performance review notice, but the kind of administrative language that could be either thing without technically being either. She arrived at 1:55 and was shown into the same conference room with the PowerPoint lighting. Different people were at the table this time. Sylvia Park was there, which she had expected. Robert Fielding was there. Drayton was there, which she had also expected, though he was sitting further from the head of the table than he usually positioned himself. And she noted that what she had not expected were the 2 individuals at the far end of the table who were not hospital administrators. One was a woman in her late 40s in a civilian blazer with a military command liaison badge clipped to her lapel. The other was a man she didn't recognize in a dark suit, not military, not hospital, who had the particular quality of stillness that she associated with federal oversight functions. He had a notepad, and he had not opened it. She sat down. Park said, "Thank you for coming in, Mara. First name." That was new, of course. I want to start by saying that what happened last night, the care provided to all 4 patients and to General Cade specifically, has been reviewed by our Chief of Staff and by the Medical Command Liaison present today. The outcomes are being characterized as excellent. Mara waited. However, Park continued, "There are some regulatory questions that need to be addressed. The procedures you performed last night are, as I understand it, outside the standard scope of practice for a registered nurse in this state." The liaison at the end of the table spoke. Her voice was measured and unhurried. "Before we get into that," she said, "I'd like to clarify something for the record." She opened a folder. "Ms. Sloane, can you confirm that you are the same Mara Sloane listed in this service record?" She slid a document across the table. Mara looked at it. She did not pick it up. She knew what was in it. She had known this was coming from the moment Reese had said her name in the ER. "Yes," she said. The liaison looked at Park. She looked at Fielding. She looked at Drayton, with an expression that was entirely neutral and, somehow, through its neutrality, communicated a very great deal. Then I think, the liaison said, we should probably discuss what credentials we're actually talking about, because the service record indicates that Ms. Sloane holds a military occupational specialty of 68W, that's healthcare specialist, with advanced training in trauma surgery, assistance, emergency, medicine, independent duty, and tactical casualty care. She completed 2 combat deployments, was assigned as primary medical officer for a special operations unit during her final deployment, and holds certifications that include emergency trauma technician, advanced cardiac life support, and tactical combat casualty care at instructor level. Silence. Drayton's face did something she hadn't seen it do before. It went through several expressions quickly, like a man sorting through a drawer looking for something he was increasingly sure wasn't in there. Park said slowly, she listed herself as a registered nurse on her application. She is a registered nurse, the liaison said. She's also those other things. The nursing license is current and in good standing. The military credentials are classified at various levels, which is why they don't appear on civilian documentation. She closed the folder. The pericardiocentesis she performed last night falls within the scope of military independent duty certification, which is recognized under federal medical authority for emergency situations involving military personnel. Park looked at Mara. Mara looked back at Park. Why didn't you disclose this? Park asked. She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the 6 months and the notebooks and the 17 triage irregularities and the written warning in her file and the patient in Bay 3 whose lung had nearly collapsed while Drayton told her to go back to Bay 6. I disclosed what was relevant to the job I applied for, she said. Night shift registered nurse. That's what you hired. That's what you got. Park looked like she wanted to say something more about that, and had decided this was not the moment. The man in the dark suit had still not opened his notepad. Drayton said, and she could hear the effort in his voice, the particular strain of someone trying to maintain a position while the ground under it was actively shifting. The regulatory questions remain regardless of her military background. She operated outside hospital protocol during a critical event without physician authorization. The liaison looked at him. Just looked at him, Doctor. Drayton, she said, General Cade is alive. His cardiac surgeon's report indicates that the initial pericardiocentesis was correctly performed and directly contributed to his survival. The general himself has submitted a statement from his hospital room this morning that specifically names Ms. Sloane and requests that her role in his care be formally recognized. She paused. Is there a specific regulatory concern you'd like to raise against that record? Drayton opened his mouth. He closed it. The man in the dark suit wrote something on his notepad. Just one thing. Small. He capped his pen. Park said, I think we should take a short break. The break lasted 22 minutes. Marissa sat in the hallway on a bench outside the conference room and drank water from a paper cup. Reese appeared at the end of the hallway at minute 7 and walked toward her, and she was not surprised to see him. He sat on the bench beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. How is he? She asked. Out of surgery. Stable. Arnstein says full recovery expected, which apparently means he'll be impossible by next week. That sounds right. Reese looked at his hands. He had big hands, the kind that looked like they'd been used for most of their life, which they had been. He wants to see you, he said. I know. He wants to make a statement about last night. He's talking to Jag this afternoon about formally documenting the circumstances. She nodded. Mara. He stopped. Started again. There are people in that room who are going to try to make last night look like a liability problem rather than what it actually was. No, you're going to need to be ready for that. She looked at the paper cup in her hands. She turned it slowly, the way she did when she was thinking something through not nervous energy, just the physical habit of a person who thought better with her hands occupied. I've been ready for it. For about 4 months, she said. Reese looked at her. I have documentation, she said. Patient outcomes, triage irregularities, a formal complaint that was filed against me 6 weeks ago for identifying a tension pneumothorax in a patient who would otherwise have died. I have dates, case references, and enough pattern evidence to support a nursing board inquiry into the operation of this ER under its current leadership. She paused. I wasn't going to use it until I had everything I needed. Last night accelerated the timeline. Reese was quiet for a moment. You've been building a case, he said. I've been doing my job, she said. The documentation is a byproduct. He almost smiled. Not quite. Same thing, he said. The conference room door opened, and Park's assistant appeared in the hallway. Mara stood. She straightened her jacket. She dropped the paper cup in the recycling bin beside the bench. She walked back toward the room and its PowerPoint lighting and the man in the dark suit who had written one small thing on his notepad and capped his pen, and she was thinking as she walked about the second notebook in her apartment drawer. She was thinking it was time to bring it in. The man in the dark suit looked up when she entered the room, and his expression was the careful blankness of someone who had already made a series of assessments and was waiting to see how many of them she would confirm in the next hour. He sat down. She looked at Drayton. He looked back at her, and she could see for the first time clearly in the full light of the room that he had understood something in the last 22 minutes that he had not understood before. He had understood that the ground was not going to hold. He just didn't know yet exactly how far it was going to fall. The man in the dark suit uncapped his pen again, and this time he turned to a fresh page. Miss Sloane, he said, I'd like to start from the beginning. She folded her hands on the table. How far back? She said. He looked at her steadily. As far back as it goes, he said. She held his gaze. Outside, somewhere in the building, a monitor alarm went off and was answered within 4 seconds. She counted them automatically, the way she always did, and then the floor returned to its ordinary sounds, its ordinary motion, the work of keeping people alive, going on the way it always went on, indifferent to whatever was happening in conference rooms. She took a breath. Then you'll want to know about the triage irregularities, she said. There have been 17 documented instances in 6 months. I can give you the first one, and then you can tell me how much detail you want on the rest. The man in the dark suit began to write. Drayton's hand, resting on the table, closed slowly into a fist. She gave him the first one in full detail. Date, time, patient identifier, presenting complaint, triage category, assigned versus triage category, warranted, attending physician, outcome. She recited it the way she had written it, without editorializing, without emphasis, with the particular flatness of someone who had organized their anger into something more useful than anger. The man in the dark suit wrote. His name, she had learned during the break, was Harlan Voss, no relation to Deanna. She had checked the spanning, she had checked the spelling, and he worked for the Office of Inspector General of the Department of Defense, though he had not said this directly. She had inferred it from the badge he had briefly shown during introductions, and from the specific nature of his questions, which were the questions of someone who already knew about a third of the answers and was using the remaining 2/3 to map the shape of what he didn't yet know. She gave him the second incident. By the fourth, Sylvia Park had stopped taking notes. She was listening in a different way now. The way administrators listen when they realize the thing being described is going to require a response that goes beyond what they came into the room prepared to give. By the seventh incident, Drayton said, "These are unsubstantiated." Mara looked at him. They're dated, time-stamped clinical observations with corresponding patient chart numbers. Substandard, if by that you mean you haven't seen the documentation yet. I mean, there's no corroboration. Dr. Patel was present for incidents 2, 9, and 14. Charge Nurse Voss was present for incidents 4 and 11. The patient outcome data is in the hospital system and can be cross-referenced with triage timestamps. She paused. I can also tell you that incidents 3, 8, and 16 involve patients who were later readmitted within 72 hours with complications consistent with under-triaged presentations. Those readmissions are in the system as well. Harlan Voss had not stopped writing. Park looked at Drayton. It was a brief look, and Drayton didn't see it because he was looking at Mara, but she saw it the specific look of an administrator recalculating the cost of a position she had previously decided to defend. Drayton said, "I want to consult with legal counsel before this continues." Voss said, "That's your right, Dr. Drayton. This meeting can pause." He said it without urgency, without judgment, in the same measured tone he had used for everything. However, I want to be transparent. It's being documented here is part of a broader review that is going to proceed regardless of this meeting's outcome. The scope of that review extends beyond this facility. Silence. Mara looked at her hands on the table. She had known the man in the dark suit was not just about last night, not just about General Cady. She had suspected something larger was attached to him. From the moment he walked in the particular way, he didn't react to anything. The notepad he'd held closed for so long. That kind of restraint meant he already had a structure and was building toward it. You didn't sit quiet through a meeting like that unless you had more than you were showing. "What broader review?" Park said. Voss turned to her. "I'm not at liberty to detail the full scope right now. What I tell you is that this facility has been flagged intentionally to a procurement irregularity that has been under investigation for approximately 8 months. The events of last night created a secondary thread that led us here. Procurement irregularity. Mara filed that, set it aside for later processing. She had not known about a procurement investigations, had not known this specific thing. But she had known, in a broader and less specific sense, that something in the administrative layer of Harlow General was wrong in ways that went beyond Drayton. You could feel it in the way information moved through the building, in the particular hesitations that happened around budget discussions, in the fact that 3 supply complaints she had filed through proper channels had vanished without response. She had not known what it was exactly. Now she had a direction. The meeting dissolved 20 minutes later without formal resolution, which was itself a kind of resolution, the kind where everyone understands that the ground has shifted and that the new positions need to be established before formal language can attach to them. Park asked her to remain available for further meetings. Voss asked for a copy of her documentation in whatever format she was able to provide. The liaison from military command shook her hand at the door, a firm and specific handshake that carried the weight of an acknowledgement she wasn't going to give out loud in the room. Drayton left without speaking. She watched him go. She watched his back, his shoulders, the set of his jaw that she could read from behind, still rigid, still arranged in the posture of authority, but the quality had changed. Something in the carriage of a man who was used to being the most dangerous person in any administrative room, and who was beginning to understand he wasn't anymore. She brought the notebook in the next morning, not to the hospital, not yet. She drove to the federal building downtown and asked for Harlan Voss by the name she had for him, and after 40 minutes in a lobby chair, she was shown to a room on the 6th floor that smelled like recycled air and old carpet. And Voss came in with coffee for both of them and sat across from her and opened his notepad to a fresh page. She put the notebook on the table between them. He looked at it. He didn't reach for it. "You want to tell me what's in there?" he said. 17 documented triage irregularities. 11 incidents of supply substitution equipment logged as delivered that either wasn't delivered or was substituted for a lower grade product. 4 instances of clinical outcome discrepancy between what was documented in patient charts and what I observed during the relevant care. She paused. And 6 months of shift data showing that patient mortality outcomes on nights when Dr. Drayton was the attending on call are statistically different from nights when he wasn't. Voss was quiet for a moment. You ran your own mortality analysis. I subtracted the medically explicable variance. Acuity matched, time of night matched, volume matched. The remaining gap isn't noise. How big is the gap? She told him. He picked up his pen. She slid the notebook across the table. General Cade was moved out of the ICU on day 3. She went to see him on day 4, which was the first day visitors outside the military liaison staff were permitted. Reese met her at the elevator bank on the cardiac recovery floor and walked her to the room without being asked, which told her something about how tightly things were being managed and what category she had been placed in. Cade was sitting up when she came in. He looked like what he was, a man in his late 50s who had recently had his chest opened and repaired, and was now performing the specific work of recovery, which was mostly endurance and impatience. He had color back. He had IV lines in both arms and a telemetry visible at the collar of his gown, and the expression of someone who was used to being in charge of large complex things and was finding the experience of being managed intensely uncomfortable. He looked at her when she came through the door, and something changed in his face, brief, real, the kind of unguarded response that surfaces in people who have recently been close to dying and haven't yet rebuilt the full set of their defenses. "There she is," he said, "General." She pulled the visitor's chair closer and sat. "How's the pain?" "Managed." He said it the way people said things that meant the opposite. "Arnstein tells me I'll live." "You will. She says the drainage you did bought me about 12 minutes, give or take." He looked at her for a moment. She let him look. "Why are you here?" he said, not unkindly. He meant at Harlow General, in a night shift nursing role, without her record visible. He meant the larger question. She had thought about how to answer this. Had thought about it for the 4 days since his surgery, and also intermittently for the 2 years before that. "I needed to stop," she said, "for a while. I needed to be somewhere nothing was trying to kill anyone. And I found other things that needed to be fixed." She paused. The stopping didn't take. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in that neighborhood. Then he stopped, because laughing pulled on the incision, and he put his hand flat against his chest with the automatic reaction of someone reminding their body not to do that. "There's a formal investigation opening," he said, when his breath had steadied. "Into the hospital's administrative conduct. Procurement primarily, but also clinical oversight. Voss's office." "I know. You gave him the notebook." "Yes. He called me this morning. He said it was the most organized informal documentation he'd seen outside of a formal audit." He looked at her. He said it like it was a mild, disturbing compliment. It was meant as one. Katie was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities did, indifferent, constant, moving in the particular register of a weekday morning that had no idea what had happened 4 floors above it 3 nights ago. "Drayton filed a formal nursing board complaint yesterday," he said. She had expected this. She had been told as much, though not officially. "Against me specifically," she said. "It wasn't a question. Against you specifically," citing the pericardiocentesis and 2 other interventions from the night of the crash as outside nursing scope. "He's arguing you presented a clinical danger that should be investigated." She sat with this. "The timing is interesting," she said. "Yes," Katie agreed, "it is." A man under federal procurement investigation filing a complaint against the person who provided the documentation for that investigation 3 days after the investigation opens. Voss's office is aware of the timing. Good. Cade looked at her steadily. He had the kind of gaze that came from a career of making decisions that mattered, not hard, exactly, but weighted, careful with what it chose to rest on. "I'm going to make a statement," he said. To the nursing board, if necessary. To the hospital's credentialing committee. To whoever needs to hear it. About what you did and what you are." She looked at the floor for a moment. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't." He shifted in the bed, the small, careful movement of someone navigating incision pain. "Mara, you pulled 30 cc of blood, out of my pericardial sac in an ER bay without anyone telling you to, in front of a room full of people who thought you were a floor nurse. You bought me enough time to get to a table. I've seen a lot of medical interventions in a lot of conditions, and I know the difference between someone performing a procedure and someone performing it correctly. She didn't say anything. You saved my life, he said. I'm going to say that wherever I need to say it. She looked at him. She thought about all the people she hadn't saved. She thought about them regularly, in the specific way that people who have worked in trauma environments carry their losses not as regret, exactly, more as a permanent low-frequency awareness, a weight that you learned to distribute so it didn't break any one part of you. She thought, this one made it. Thank you, she said, for saying that. The nursing board notification arrived on a Thursday. It was formal, official, and described a complaint alleging that she had performed procedures outside the legal scope of registered nursing practice in North Carolina on the night of April 24th. She was notified of her right to respond, her right to representation, and the timeline for the preliminary review process. She read it twice. She put it on the kitchen table next to her coffee. She looked at the plant on the windowsill, which needed watering. She watered the plant. Then she called the number that the military command liaison had given her during the handshake at the conference room door, and she left a message that was 5 sentences long, and she went to work. The hospital felt different when she walked in that morning. Not dramatically, the lights were the same, the noise level was the same. The smell of a functioning R was the same antiseptic and coffee and particular human specificity that it always was. But the geometry of how people responded to her presence had shifted. She first noticed it at the nurse's station. Brenda, the travel nurse, met her eyes and nodded, not a casual nod, but a deliberate one, the kind that meant something. Adeyemi was coming off a late shift and stopped in the hallway to thank her, specifically for the blast TBI catch on the burn patient, who had been confirmed to have elevated intracranial pressure and had been treated in time to prevent lasting neurological damage. He would have been discharged with the burns treated and the head injury untouched, Adeyemi said. He was tired, 27-hour tired, the kind that put everything in the face, and he wasn't performing gratitude, he was just stating a fact that mattered to him. Thank you. You did the assessment, she said. You told me where to look. She went to her station. She started her shift. Drayton arrived 40 minutes later, and she watched from across the department as he moved through the space and registered the same change. She had the small recalibrations in body language as staff responded to him with a fraction less deference than before. The particular quality of a room that had started the process of reassessing a person and was not entirely done yet, but was clearly in motion. He came to her station at 8:45. He stood. She was charting. The nursing board complaint is proceeding, he said. I know. I received the notification. I want you to understand that it's not personal. She looked up at him. She held the look long enough to make clear she was deciding how to respond to that. And then she said, everything you've done has been personal, Doctor. Drayton, from the first week. I'd rather you didn't frame it as institutional. His jaw tightened. You don't know what you've started. I know exactly what I've started. He left. She went back to charting. At 10:15, 3 things happened in the space of about 20 minutes, and the combination of them changed the shape of the day entirely. The first was a call to the nurse's station from the hospital's legal department, informing charge nurse Deanna Voss that an external audit team from the Office of Inspector General would be on site the following Monday to begin a formal review of procurement records, supply chain documentation, and clinical outcome data from the previous 18 months. Voss relayed this information during the 11 o'clock briefing with the expression of someone who had been expecting something and was still not entirely prepared for it to arrive. The second was Patel finding her in the medication room and telling her, in a voice kept deliberately low, that he had submitted a written statement to Voss's office. That morning, a detailed account of the Bay 3 incident 6 weeks ago, the night she had identified the developing pneumothorax and been ordered out of the bay, and what he had observed her do, and why. He had also attached his own notes from the night of the crash. He was sweating slightly, and his hands weren't quite still, and she recognized the look of someone who had made a decision that cost something and was still determining whether the cost was the right one. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." He paused. "I should have done it 6 weeks ago." She looked at him. He wasn't asking for reassurance. He was just saying the true thing, which she respected. "It'll matter," she said. "Thank you." The third thing was the patient who arrived in Bay 2 at 10:58. He was brought in by private vehicle. The driver, a woman in her 60s, who was clearly the patient's wife, had apparently driven him herself because he had refused to call an ambulance, which was the kind of decision made by people who were either in denial about how sick they were or who had spent enough time around hospitals to develop a specific aversion. The patient was 51 years old, male, heavyset, with chest pain that had started 40 minutes earlier. He told the intake nurse it was indigestion. He said the word indigestion 3 separate times, with the particular insistence of a man who needed a specific and manageable explanation for something that was frightening him. Mara was not assigned to Bay 2. She was assigned to Bays 5 and 6. She walked past Bay 2 at 11:03 to retrieve a supply from the cart near the entrance, and she looked in as she passed, and she stopped. The attending in Bay 2 was a physician, she knew only slightly doctor. Renata Ose, a second-year attending who had come from internal medicine and was competent, but whose ER experience was still in the early stages of becoming instinct. She was reviewing the intake form. The nurse was attaching leads for the ECG. Mara looked at the patient. She looked at the color of his face. The particular grayish cast that was different from anxiety, pallor, different from baselines in skin, tone, that sat on top of everything like a change in the ambient light. She looked at the way he was holding himself, the subtle forward lean, the left arm positioned in the specific way that people positioned it when there was pain radiating somewhere they weren't connecting to the chest. She looked at his wife, who was standing in the corner of the bay, holding a purse with both hands and watching her husband, but didn't know of a expression frightened of which is the worst kind of frightened to be. She stepped into the bay. "Dr. Ose," she said quietly. "When did the ECG leads go on?" Ose looked up. "Just now. We're getting the trace. What's his pressure?" 142/94. "Diaphoretic on intake?" "Mildly." Mara looked at the monitor. The ECG trace was just beginning to resolve. She looked at the ST segment in leads ED and AVF. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. "He's having an inferior MI," she said. "Right now. ST elevation, something. AVF, the systemi. Not indigestion. You need to activate the cath lab." OC came to the monitor. She looked. Her face changed. "Activate cath lab. STEMI protocol," she said, and the room shifted into the specific rapid motion of a protocol being correctly executed, the nurse calling the code, the additional staff arriving, the medications being drawn, the patient's position being adjusted as they explained to him what was happening and what was going to happen next. The patient looked at Mara. He was scared now. The indigestion story had collapsed, and he was in the room with what was actually happening, which was that his heart was partially occluded and the tissue downstream was running out of time. "Am I going to be okay?" he said. She looked at him. "You got here in time," she said. "That's what matters." It was not a complete answer. It was the true part of the answer, which was the part he needed right now. She stepped back out of the bay. Osi caught her in the hallway 20 seconds later. She stopped. Started again. "How did you see that from the doorway?" "Pattern recognition," Mara said. "It comes with repetition." She went back to Bay 5. She had been there 6 minutes when Drayton appeared in the hallway outside, and she could see through the glass that he had been informed about Bay 2. Someone had told him. Or he had seen the cath lab activation go through the system. And he was standing still in a way that meant he was processing something, rather than moving toward something. He looked at her through the glass. She looked back. Then Deanna Voss appeared from the direction of the nurse's station, and she was holding a folder, and the expression on her folder was the kind that preceded significant news, and she was not walking toward Drayton. She was walking toward Mara. She stopped outside Bay 5. She opened the glass door. "I need to speak with you," she said. Her voice was different from any register Mara had heard from her before, stripped of the professional distance. Something underneath it that might have been apology and might have been fear, and was probably both at once. Mara came out of the bay. Voss held the folder without opening it. She looked at Mara the way you look at someone when you are trying to figure out how you missed something for a long time. "The OIG audit team called ahead this morning," Voss said. "They sent a preliminary brief to our legal department. It arrived an hour ago." She paused. "It outlines procurement irregularities over a 14-month period, specifically medical supply substitution, false delivery confirmations, and a billing discrepancy in the 7-figure range." Mara waited. "Dr. Drayton's name is in the brief," Voss said, "as a co-signatory on 6 of the fraudulent delivery confirmations." The hallway was the same hallway it had been 30 seconds ago. The light was the same. The distant sounds of the ER were the same. Mara looked at the folder. "There's something else," Voss said. She opened it. Inside was a printed email chain hospital server, time-stamped, not deleted, but apparently not known to be visible. The kind of oversight that happened when someone felt secure enough in their position to not be careful. The chain was between Drayton and 2 other names she didn't recognize. The content was a discussion of a specific nursing staff member, referred to by last name only, Sloane, and the language used to describe the approach to managing her was precise enough to establish intent and damaging enough that even reading it secondhand in a hospital hallway, while already knowing most of what had been done to her, she felt something cold move through her chest. He had known from her 3rd month that her background was likely more than what her application showed. He had flagged her deliberately. He had filed the written warning not because of a genuine clinical concern, but as a prophylactic measure, a paper trail designed to discredit whatever she might eventually produce. He had been trying to build a case against her before she built one against him. She read the email chain twice. She closed the folder and handed it back. She looked at Voss. "When did you know?" she said. Voss's face moved. "About the emails just now. About the triage irregularities." A pause. The kind of pause that was itself an answer. "Not specifically," Voss said. "I knew something was I didn't want to." She stopped. Mara looked at her. "I know," she said. She did know. She understood the specific shape of institutional inaction, the way it felt to see something wrong, and calculate the cost of naming it, and decide, over and over, that the cost was more than you were willing to pay. She didn't have contempt for it. She didn't have contempt for it. Something more complicated than contempt, something that recognized the weakness without excusing the outcome. "What happens now?" Voss asked. Mara thought about it. "Now the OIG team comes on Monday," she said, "and they find what they find. And people answer for what they've done." She paused. "That's how it's supposed to work." She walked back toward Bay 5. She was halfway there when the intercom came on. "Security to administrative floor, room 412. Security to administrative floor, room 412. Room 412 was the office suite that Drayton occupied as ER chief. She stopped walking. She did not turn around, but she heard, from the direction of the elevator bank, the sound of raised voices, and one of them was Drayton's, and it was the kind of voice she had never heard from him before. The voice of someone who had spent years as the most powerful person in their immediate environment and had just discovered that the environment had changed around them while they were looking somewhere else. She stood still and listened. The voice got louder for a moment, then cut off, the specific silence of an elevator closing. Then it was just the ER again, just the monitors and the motion and the ordinary, extraordinary work of keeping people alive. She turned around, down the hallway, standing at the nurse's station, with a stillness that she recognized was Harlan Voss. He was looking at her. He had a phone in one hand and the notepad in the other, and the notepad had a great deal of writing on it now, many pages worth, and he was looking at her with a particular expression of someone who has arrived at the end of a long calculation and found the answer to be exactly what they had suspected from the beginning. He gave her a small nod. She gave him one back. Then a bay alarm went off, Bay 3, patient in respiratory distress, the kind of alarm that doesn't wait for anything, and she moved without hesitation, her whole body shifting into the particular gear she had spent years developing, the gear that existed past exhaustion and past fear and past whatever was happening in room 412 and whatever was written in the notepad. She moved toward the sound. That was what she had always done. But this time, when she came through the bay door and the nurses turned toward her with the instinctive motion of people recognizing the most capable person in the room, they did not look past her. They did not look over her shoulder for someone else. They looked at her. And from the hallway, she heard something she had not heard in 6 months at this facility. Something she had not expected to hear today of all days, when everything was still in motion and nothing was fully resolved. And the folder with the email chain was still in Voss's hands, and Drayton's voice was still somewhere in the building. She heard Adeyemi's voice from the nurse's station, saying her name to a resident who had just come onto the floor and didn't know the situation. That's Mara Sloane, he said. Just that. Just the name. And the particular way he said it, the way you said the name of someone who had earned the weight of the sentence. She did not stop to hear the rest. She was already in the bay. She was already working. But something in the quality of the room had shifted something, in how the other nurse moved aside, without being asked, how the resident positioned themselves at the angle she would want, how the space organized itself around her presence, and she felt it, the thing she had almost forgotten the feeling of. Not comfort, not victory, just being where you were supposed to be, doing what you were supposed to do, with people who had finally started to see it. The patient in Bay 3 was a 40-year-old woman with acute bronchospasm and a saturation that needed to be higher than it was, and Mara had her on the nebulizer and the correct medication protocol within 90 seconds, and the numbers started moving in the right direction. And it was not dramatic, it was just competence, sustained and reliable, the kind that was invisible when things went well and catastrophic when it wasn't there. The saturation climbed. She watched it climb. Then her pager went off. Not the hospital pager. The other one, the small secondary device she had carried since the meeting with the military command liaison. The one that had not gone off once in the 4 days since she'd received it, the one she had almost started to think was precautionary rather than functional. She looked at the message. It was from Reese. 4 words. Cade. Now? Bring Vost. She looked at the pager for 2 seconds. Then she looked at the patient in Bay 3 whose saturation was at 94 and climbing, whose bronchospasm was loosening under the nebulizer, who was going to be all right. She handed the nebulizer off to the nurse beside her. Keep her on the treatment for 12 minutes. If the sat drops below 92, call me. She was out of the bay before the nurse answered. Harlan Voss was still at the nurse's station. She crossed the floor toward him. She crossed the floor toward him with the directional certainty of someone who had already made all the relevant decisions. Cade wants us, she said. Voss looked at her. Then he looked at the pager she was still holding. Both of us, she said. He closed the notepad. He picked up his coffee, took one drink, set it down, and stood. They took the elevator. The cardiac recovery floor had a different quality than the ER slower, more measured. the kind of institutional quiet that existed in the space between acute crisis and actual recovery, where the bodies were stabilizing and the some minds were catching up to what had happened to them. It smelled like antiseptic and the particular staleness of rooms where windows didn't open. Reese was in the hallway outside Katie's room. He was not alone. Beside him stood a woman Mara didn't recognize, late 40s, in a blazer, with a lanyard badge that she angled away from immediate reading, which was either habit or intention, probably both. Behind them, partially visible through the open door, was a second man in a suit who was not Reese's usual security detail. She had a feeling about suits in hallways. It was not a comfortable feeling, but it was an accurate one. Reese opened the door. Cade was sitting up in bed with the specific alertness of someone who had been awake and working for a while, the kind of presence that gathered in a room whether the person was in a uniform or a hospital gown, that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with the accumulated weight of a long career spent making decisions that other people had to live with. He looked at Voss first. "You're OIG," he said. "Yes, sir," Voss said. "Harlan Voss." "Yes, sir." Cade looked at Mara. "Sit down," he said. "Both of you." They sat. The woman from the hallway came in and stood near the window. The second suit remained outside. Reese positioned himself by the door. Cade said, "I'll keep this direct. This morning I received a briefing from my command about the scope of what Voss's office has been investigating. The procurement irregularities." He paused. He was managing his breath carefully, not dramatically, just with the deliberate economy of someone whose chest wall was still healing and who had learned to be thoughtful about it. "I also received separately a copy of the nursing board complaint filed by Dr. Drayton." He looked at Mara. "I submitted my statement this morning. 14 pages. Detailed clinical account of what you did, beginning from when I arrived at that OR, cross-referenced with Arnstein's operative notes and Patel's concurrent observations." He held her gaze. "The board will have it by end of day," she said. "You didn't have to write 14 pages. I was thorough. You were supposed to be resting. I was lying down the whole time." He almost smiled. "The procurement investigation is moving faster than Voss's office anticipated. The preliminary audit data supports a pattern of substitution fraud going back 22 months. The 6 delivery confirmations co-signed by Drayton are part of it, but they're not the center of it." He looked at Voss. "Who is?" Voss said. "The hospital's COO. A man named Gerald Pitts." Cade said it with the flat delivery of someone who had already worked through his own reaction to the name and moved past it. "Pitts has been running the substitution scheme through a shell vendor that he partly owns. Drayton's involvement appears to have compensated cooperation." It sounds a sign. He signed what he was told to sign and looked away from the supply irregular suggests were private consulting payments routed through a separate account. The room was quiet. Mara thought about the supply complaints she had filed, the ones that vanished. She thought about the specific complaints surgical packs, rated for 1 load tolerance delivered with a lower tolerance suture material from an unverified manufacturer, IV bags, with a shorter stability window than what was being documented. She had flagged them because they were wrong. She had not known exactly how they were wrong in a way that went upstream of Drayton. Now she knew. "Pitts is in the building today?" Voss said. "As of 40 minutes ago, yes." Voss reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He stepped toward the window and made a call that was quiet enough to be 2 or 3 sentences, and then he came back. "His office is being secured," he said. Cade nodded. The woman by the window, whose name Mara would later learn was Special Agent Lorraine Falk, said, "Miss Sloane, the nursing complaint becomes significantly more complex if the person who filed it is himself under federal investigation for procurement fraud. The board's preliminary review council has been notified of the overlap. They're likely to pause the review pending the outcome of the federal proceedings." "That's not a dismissal," Mara said. "No," Falk agreed. It's not. But the 14-page statement from a sitting brigadier general and the corroborating observationalism from two physicians will weigh substantially when the review does proceed. Mara looked at her hands. She had a specific reaction to good news that was not quite relief, something more guarded than that. The response of someone who had learned to wait for the thing after the good news before deciding what the good news actually meant. There's something else, Cade said. She looked up. He picked up a single sheet of paper from the bedside table and held it out. She took it. It was a letter. Hospital letterhead, the administration's, not the ER's. Dated that morning. Signed by Sylvia Park. It was, in precise administrative language, a formal suspension of Dr. Felix Drayton from clinical and administrative duties at Harlow General Medical Center. Effective immediately and pending the outcome of an internal investigation into allegations of procurement fraud, clinical misconduct, and inappropriate use of the hospital's complaint and disciplinary systems. She read it twice. She set it on the edge of the bed. Park moved fast, she said. Park was shown the email chain at 8 this morning, Cade said. The one where Drayton documented his strategy for managing you. I understand she was not pleased. Mara thought about Park's face in the conference room 5 days ago. The recalculating look, the specific expression of someone who had been defending a position and was beginning to assess the cost of continuing to defend it. No, she said. I imagine she wasn't. She was back on the floor by noon. The ER looked the same. It always looked the same. That was one of the things that was both functional and strange about emergency medicine. The way the department absorbed events and continued moving, the way it didn't stop to register what had happened in the administrative layer above it. People were still sick. Monitors were still alarming. Residents were still learning at the speed that life required of them. Drayton's office was dark. She walked past it on the way to the medication room. The door was closed and the light was off, and his name was still on the plate beside the door, which would be changed later, but right now it was still there. Still reading, Doctor. Felix Drayton, her chief, and her chief, and she looked at it for 1 second and then looked away and kept walking. The shift was long and ordinary in the way that shifts are ordinary after extraordinary things. The extraordinary things don't end the ordinary ones. They just layer underneath them. And you carry both at once, which was fine, which was what she was used to. At 2 in the afternoon, Deanna Voss found her in Bay 5 and stood in the doorway. The nurses want to talk to you, Deanna said. Mara looked up from the chart she was reviewing. Which nurses? All of them, Deanna said. The ones on shift. And she stopped. And some who aren't, who came in anyway. She put the chart down. The break room was full, not overflowing. There wasn't enough space in a hospital break room for overflowing, but full in the specific way that meant every person in there had made a choice to be there, which was different from the usual assembled by-shift composition of the space. She knew most of them, the ones she knew well, and the ones she only knew by face, and the ones whose she was still learning, after 6 months of deliberate invisibility. Patricia, the nurse who had changed her break schedule after the formal complaint. But she was there. Brenda, the travel nurse from the crash night. She was there. Garrett, the trauma tech, who had handed her the pericardiocentesis tray without asking questions. 2 nurses from the ICU who had nothing formally to do with the ER complaint, but who had apparently heard and decided proximity mattered. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then a nurse named Claudette, a 10-year veteran of the night shift, who Mara had spoken to maybe 8 times in 6 months, said, "We submitted statements." Mara waited to the OIG office and to the nursing board. Claudette's voice was level. She was a woman who chose words carefully and didn't use them to perform emotion. Most of us. About things we saw, things we should have said before. Mara looked around the room. Patricia was looking at the floor. That was honest, not avoiding, just sitting with something. It took a while, Claudette said, to get here. I know, Mara said. Claudette stopped. She was not a woman who stumbled often, and the stumble registered. We're sorry it took this long. Mara looked at her. She'd thought about 6 months of changed break schedules and averted eyes, and the particular weight of a department that had decided collectively that the safest thing was to not be standing near her. She knew how that decision was made. She had watched it happen in real time. She held no specific grudge against any individual face in this room. What she held was something more complicated, the particular mix of understanding and grief that came from knowing that institutions produced this behavior reliably, and that the people inside them were usually not villains and not cowards, but just human, which meant they calculated costs and made choices, and sometimes chose wrong. "It matters that you're here now," she said. She meant it without qualification. Claudette nodded. The room exhaled slightly. "What happens next?" Patricia said. She had looked up from the floor. Her voice had the quality of someone asking a real question rather than a rhetorical one. "The OIG team comes Monday," Mara said. "They're going to look at everything. Procurement, clinical outcomes, the complaint and disciplinary records. That process takes time. There will be interviews. Be honest. That's all, just be honest about what you saw and when you saw it. And Drayton is suspended. The investigation will determine what comes after that." She paused. "It won't be nothing." The room held that for a moment. Garrett said, from near the door, "The pericardiocentesis. On the General. I've been thinking about it." He paused. He was 25 years old and had been a trauma tech for 8 months, and he thought carefully before speaking, which she had noticed and respected. "I've assisted on those before, with physicians. The angle you used, that was the right angle for his presentation. The one that gave the best approach to the pericardial space, given his body type." He was not asking a question. "Yes," she said. "Where did you learn to do that?" She looked at him. She thought about this question. She thought about the places and the conditions and the people she had learned from, the ones who had taught her with patience and the ones who had taught her by necessity, and the ones who had died before she fully understood what they had given her. "A lot of places," she said, "over a lot of time." Garrett nodded. He filed that. She could see him filing it, the specific expression of someone storing information for later, rather than needing to process it immediately. She left the break room. The COO, Gerald Pitts, was escorted from the building at 3:47 p.m. She didn't see it happen directly. She was in Bay 4 with a patient when it happened. But she heard about it in the particular rapid way that significant events move through a hospital building faster than any formal announcement, slower than rumor, with just enough detail to be credible, and just enough incompleteness to keep people talking. Pitts had been in his office with building security and 2 of Voss's team when he had apparently attempted to make a call that was intercepted. She didn't know the specifics of that yet and wasn't sure she'd get them, and the attempt had shifted. The nature of the interaction from cooperative to formal in the space of about 10 minutes. He had left through the administrative entrance, which was not the main entrance, which was probably deliberate. She heard this from Adeyemi, who had heard it from a nurse who had been near the administrative floor, who had seen the exit directly. The version that reached her was probably 70% accurate, which was at Setson, which was better than most things that moved through buildings at that speed. She finished with her patient in Bay 4. She logged the chart. She moved to Bay 6. At 5 in the afternoon, Voss appeared on the floor, again not rushing, not with the energy of someone managing a crisis, just walking toward her with the unhurried certainty of someone who had accomplished something. He stopped beside her. "Pitts has retained counsel and declined to cooperate further," he said. "That's fine. We have 22 months of procurement records, 6 of Drayton's co-signatures, 3 years of the shell vendor's financial activity, and now a forensic image of Pitts's hard drive that his counsel cannot retroactively complain about because it was taken before he retained counsel." He paused. "The case is solid." "What about the clinical negligence piece?" she said. "That runs separately through the state medical board." The OVIG referral goes out this week. 3 of the patients from your documentation, the ones with the readmission complications, have been identified and their families will be contacted by the board's patient advocate. She took that in. Those 3 patients were not abstractions to her. She had case numbers in the notebook, but she also had in the part of her memory that she didn't consult very often because it wasn't useful to consult it too frequently, the specific texture of each of their presentations, what she had seen, what she had flagged, what had happened afterward. Good, she said. It was the only word that fit. Voss looked at her. You know, he said, most people who build the kind of documentation you built are doing it because they're planning to take it somewhere. Use it for something specific. He paused. You weren't planning to go to OIG. No. Where were you planning to go with it? She thought about it. She had thought about it a great deal over 6 months, the nursing board, the state health department, a journalist she had the contact information for, but had never called the hospital system's own ethics hotline, whose independence she had doubted from the beginning. I hadn't decided yet, she said. I was waiting until the documentation was complete enough that wherever I took it, it would be enough. And then last night happened. Voss nodded slowly. The procurement investigation has been running for 8 months, he said. We had the shell vendor. We had the financial trail. What we didn't have was the clinical side, the evidence that the fraud was affecting patient care, not just billing records. That's what makes it criminal negligence rather than administrative fraud. He looked at her. Your documentation provided that. Without it, Pitts faces financial fraud charges. With it, he faces criminal negligence in a healthcare context, which is a substantially different exposure. She understood what he was telling her. She had walked into this building 6 months ago planning to disappear, and she had produced, as a byproduct of simply doing her job and watching carefully and writing things down, the clinical documentation that turned a financial fraud case into something that would actually result in consequences that fit the harm. She hadn't planned that. She wasn't sure how to feel about it being true. Is there anything else you need from me? She said. Several more interviews. Your formal statement on the crash events, which we'll schedule next week. Potentially testimony, if any of this reaches a hearing stage, which it will. He looked at her steadily. You're going to be in this for a while. I know. Are you prepared for that? She considered the question, the way she considered all questions of that type, without performance, without immediate reassurance, sitting with it long enough to give an honest answer. Yes, she said. Voss nodded. He picked up his coat from the nurse's station where he had left it. He looked around the ER, the monitors, the bays, the motion of a department doing its constant work. One more thing, he said. He reached into his coat and produced a single folded page. This came through my office this afternoon. From the Nursing Board's Preliminary Review Council. Given the Drayton situation, they've requested an expedited character review for your file, rather than waiting for the full complaint process. He held it out. It's a request for documentation of your military credentials, filed directly with the Review Council. The Military Command Liaison's Office has agreed to release the relevant portions of your service record for board review. He paused. This is, in practical terms, the beginning of the complaint being addressed rather than simply suspended. She took the page. She read it. Expedited review. Full credential disclosure. Military service record attached as supporting documentation. Review Council, noting specifically that the procedures performed on April 24th that had been assessed by 3 independent clinical reviewers and found to be within the emergency independent duty. Certification scope applicable under federal medical authority. She folded the page. She put it in her pocket. Thank you, she said. Voss looked at her for a moment, not with warmth exactly, but with the specific regard of someone who had spent years in rooms with people trying to hide things and who recognized the difference between concealment and restraint. You know what I thought when I first read your documentation, he said. What? I thought, Whoever wrote this has done this before. Not the documentation specifically, the patience of it. The way it's organized for someone else to use, not just for the person who knows what it means. He paused. You were building something designed to survive you not being in the room. She looked at him. I learned that, she said, from people who weren't always in the room to explain things themselves. He picked up his coat. He walked toward the elevator. She worked until 7. It was a standard end of shift, or as standard as anything was right now, which was not very. She was in the locker room, pulling her jacket on, when Deanna Voss, whose constant proximity to the other Voss had begun to produce confused expressions in people who didn't know both of them, knocked on the doorframe. She had a look that was harder to read than her usual register. Drayton is here, she said. Mara stopped. In the building. He came back about 20 minutes ago. Security was notified. He's been told he's suspended and needs to leave. Deanna paused. He's not leaving. Mara picked up her bag. Where is he? Nurse's station. Deanna stopped again. The uncharacteristic hesitation had a specific quality. He's been talking to staff, trying to get people to, I don't know what exactly, saying it's all been mischaracterized, saying the documentation was fabricated. Mara walked out of the locker room. The ER floor was quieter at shift change, the overlapping period when the outgoing shift was wrapping documentation and the incoming shift was getting up to speed. It was not the most populated the floor would be, which meant the small cluster of people near the nurses and stay station was more visible than it might otherwise have been. Drayton was standing at the station with his jacket on, not scrubs, not a white coat, the jacket of a man who had come into the building in the mode of a person with somewhere else to be and had then not left. He had both hands on the counter, and he was talking to 2 nurses whose body language was the very particular calibration of people who were listening without agreeing and who were trying to figure out how to exit the conversation without escalating it. He saw Mara come through the door. He straightened. She walked toward him without hurrying. The 2 nurses moved slightly aside, not deliberately, just the unconscious geometry of people making space when the specific person that the energy in the room was about arrives. Drayton said, I want to talk to you. All right, she said. What you've done, this whole thing, it's going to come apart. The OIG investigation, the board complaint, all of it. You built a case on 6 months of night shift observations and a military background you hid from everyone in this building. None of that holds. She looked at him. She was aware of the nurses at the station. She was aware of Adeyemi, who had come in for his shift and was 15 feet away and not pretending not to hear. She was aware of Garrett near the supply cart. She said, the nursing board has 7 independent corroborating statements. The OIG has 22 months of procurement records and a forensic image of Pitts' hard drive. 3 patients from my documentation have been identified and their families are being contacted by the State Medical Board's patient advocate. She paused. Which part of that were you expecting to come apart? His face changed. It cycled through several things, quickly anger she had seen before, calculation she had seen before, and underneath both of those, something she had not seen from him in 6 months, the specific rawness of a man who had believed genuinely that he was the person his own story said he was, and who was in the early stages of confronting the alternative. You came into this department with a blank application, he said. You hid who you were for 6 months. You let people believe you were something you weren't. I'm a registered nurse, she said. That's what I applied as. That's what I worked as. Everything I did in this, I did correctly, and I documented every time something was done incorrectly. She held his gaze. The only thing hidden in this department for 6 months was the billing fraud, Dr. Drayton, and I wasn't the one hiding it. The counter between them was maybe 2 feet wide. It was nothing as a physical space. It was everything as a boundary. He said, and his voice had dropped, had gone to the quiet was register that she now understood was not restraint, but the sound of someone running out of positions to hold. I gave 6 years to this department. She looked at him. She understood that he meant it. She understood that the 6 years were real to him, that his identity had organized itself around the authority of those 6 years, that whatever he had done in the margins of that authority, he had probably managed to keep separate from his understanding of himself as a physician. That was not an excuse. It was not absolution. It was just what was true. I know, she said. It was 2 words. She didn't add anything to them. Security appeared at the end of the hallway, 2 of them, building security, not unkind in their approach, moving with the careful diplomacy of people who were performing a necessary function and preferred to do it quietly. Drayton looked at them. He looked back at Mara. Something in his face resolved into a blankness she hadn't seen from him before, not the blankness of restraint or strategy, but the blankness of a man who had reached the end of what he had to say and had found nothing behind it. He picked up the coat he'd set on the counter. He walked towards security. He did not look back. She watched him go. The ER absorbed the moment, the way it absorbed everything without ceremony, returning to its ordinary frequencies, the monitors and the motion and the work. Garrett appeared beside her. "You okay?" he said. She thought about the question. Her chest hurt, mildly. It did that sometimes the old injury, the surrounding tissue responding to things it had no business responding to. She was tired in a way that was mostly physical, but not entirely. She was standing in a department that had, very slowly and very imperfectly, started to find its way back to something that worked, and she had played a role in that she was still processing. "Yeah," she said. Garrett nodded. She picked up her bag. She was almost at the exit when her phone rang. Not the pager, the phone. A number she didn't have saved. She answered. A woman's voice. Measured, professional, Ms. Sloane. "This is Director Celia Marsh, Office of Medical Programs, 3rd Army Medical Command. I'm calling because General Cady has submitted a formal request through our office, and I wanted to discuss it with you directly before you hear about it through other channels." She stopped walking. "What request?" she said. "The General is proposing a joint program. Military trauma medicine and civilian emergency medicine, with Harlow General as the primary civilian partner facility. Training integration, protocol sharing, a formal bridge between battlefield medicine practice and civilian ER standards." The director's voice was even, professional, but underneath the professionalism was the particular cadence of someone delivering news they expected to matter. "He wants you to build it." Mara stood at the exit. Outside through the glass, the city was doing what it did, indifferent, constant, the ordinary life of a place where people got sick and needed help, and sometimes got it, and sometimes didn't. "That's not a small thing," she said. "No," the director said. "It isn't." The general was quite specific that it shouldn't be a small thing. Mara pressed her hand flat against the glass door. She thought about what she had come here to do, which was to stop, and what had happened instead, which was that she had not stopped, had never really been capable of stopping, and that the stopping had always been what she told herself she was doing while she was actually doing something else entirely. She said, "I'd need authority over curriculum and protocol design. I can't be decorative." A pause. "That's consistent with how the general described your likely requirements," the director said. He said, and I'm quoting directly, "She'll need the keys, or she won't come in the building." She almost laughed. Almost. Then the director said, "There's one more thing, Ms. Sloane. This morning, before the general submitted the formal program request, he made a separate submission to the Secretary of the Army's office, a formal recommendation for the reinstatement of your commission at the rank of major, effective upon your acceptance." The exit door was cold under her hand. "My commission," she said. "Your commission," the director confirmed, "which you separated from under medical circumstances that the general believes, in his words, warranted more than they received at the time. He's been in contact with the review board. The recommendation is supported." She stood there. The city was outside the glass. The ER was behind her. The monitors were alarming somewhere across the floor and being answered as they always were, as they had always been. She thought about the duffel bags in the storage unit, the folding cot she had never unfolded, the blank section of the application form, the green notebook, the dark one, the one she had filled in, the way she filled everything with the discipline of someone who had learned that what you documented outlasted what you remembered, that the truth needed a place to live that wasn't just inside one person's head. She thought about the plant on the windowsill. It was doing well. "Miss Sloane," the director said, "are you still there?" "Yes," she said. "I'm here. Do you need time to consider?" She looked at her own reflection in the glass door. It was faint. The light was wrong for a clear reflection. But she could see the outline of herself, the limp she carried, the particular set of someone who had spent a long time trying to take up very little space. "No," she said. She pushed through the door. Outside, the April evening had gone cold, the way April evenings did without warning. The temperature dropping in the space of an hour from something almost warm to something that reminded you that warmth was not a permanent state, but a condition that required maintenance. She stood on the sidewalk. She thought major. She thought build it. She thought about the 3 patients whose families were being contacted. She thought about the Bay 3 patient from 6 weeks ago, whose lung had been saved by a decision Drayton had told her was not hers to make. She thought about the woman in Bay 2 with the bronchospasm and the STEMI patient whose wife had driven him in because he'd called it indigestion, and all the ordinary critical moments of an ordinary night shift that nobody wrote articles about and nobody gave speeches about, but that were the actual substance, the thing under, the reason any of it mattered. Her phone was still in her hand. She looked at it. She thought about what she'd said to the director, "I can't be decorative," and she thought about Ketty in his hospital room, saying she'd need the keys. And she thought about Reese on the bench in the hallway, saying same thing, like it was the most obvious thing he'd ever heard. She turned around and looked at the hospital through the glass entrance. She could see the ER floor from here, barely the edge of the nurses' station, the movement of people working the shift change, the particular controlled motion of a department doing what a department did when it was functioning the way it was supposed to. She was going to make it function better. She was going to make it function better. She was going to bring the notebooks and the methodology and the decade of knowledge she had been carrying in her body and her hands and the part of her brain that never fully turned off. And she was going to build something that outlasted the immediate moment, something that would be there after she moved to the next thing and the thing after that. But first, she called Reese. He answered on the second ring. "Tell me something," she said. "What?" "The crash. The mechanism." She paused. "You said the investigation was ongoing." "Still ongoing," he said carefully. "But you know more than you knew 5 days ago." A pause. "Yes," he said. "Was it an accident?" The silence lasted 4 full seconds, which was not the silence of someone deciding whether to tell her the truth. It was the silence of someone who had been waiting for her to ask the question in those specific words. "Mara," he said, "there's something you need to see." "Mara," he said, "there's something you need to see." She stood on the sidewalk outside Harlow General, with the April cold coming off the concrete, and, the city moving around her at its ordinary indifferent pace, and she waited. Reese said, not on the phone, "Can you come back up?" She turned around and looked at the entrance. "I'm already outside." "I know. I can see you from the window." She looked up. 4th floor, cardiac recovery. He was there, a shape behind glass, phone at his ear, watching her the way people watched from hospital windows when they had something to say and weren't sure how it was going to land. She went back in. He was waiting at the elevator when it opened on the 4th floor, which meant he had something that couldn't be said in a hallway with foot traffic, which meant they went to the small family consultation room at the end of the corridor, beige walls, 3 chairs, a box of tissues on the table that was always full because nobody ever took them. They just sat there as a kind of institutional acknowledgement that bad news happened in this room and that the hospital had done what it could. Reese sat. She sat across from him. He put a tablet on the table. He turned it toward her. What she saw was a preliminary incident report, military formatting, the kind she recognized from 3 years of reading similar documents. The header indicated it came from the Aviation Safety Investigation Team attached to the 3rd Medical Command. The date was 2 days ago. The classification was marked in a way that told her Reese was showing her something he was technically allowed to show her, but only just. She read it. She read it again. The crash had not been a mechanical failure. The aviation team had found evidence of deliberate interference with the aircraft's navigation system, specifically a spoofing signal that had redirected the flight path during the approach phase, moving the aircraft over terrain that was not the intended landing corridor. The crew had identified the error and attempted to correct, but the correction window had been narrow and the terrain unforgiving. 4 people had nearly died. K-Day had nearly died. She looked up from the tablet. "Who?" she said. Reese's hands were flat on the table. He was choosing words with the kind of care that meant some of them were still restricted. "The investigation is active," he said. "What I can tell you is that the signal origin has been traced to a location associated with a communications contractor that held a services contract with General's Administrative Division." He paused. "That contract was managed through the same shell vendor structure that Pitts built." She sat with that. The procurement fraud, the supply substitution, the billing irregularities. She had thought of those as corruption of a particular institutional kind, the self-interested, incrementally normalized kind, that happened when people with access decided access was a resource to harvest. She had not thought of them as connected to something that had put 4 people in a crashed aircraft. "Pitts ordered it?" she said. "We don't know the full chain yet. What we know is that General Cade had been identified as the primary federal oversight figure for a defense medical contract review that Pitts's operation was exposed to. The crash happened 4 days before Cade was scheduled to present the preliminary findings of that review. She looked at the tablet. She looked at the report. She thought about Cade in the ER bay, gray-faced, his pressure at 62/38, his hand absent, and his heart barely working. She thought about the 12 minutes. She thought about the 12 minutes. She thought about what 12 minutes meant when the person on the other side of them had been put there deliberately. Is Pitts still in custody? Federal hold since this afternoon. The aviation findings changed the charge profile significantly. Reese looked at her steadily. This is no longer just procurement fraud. What? She understood what he was not saying directly, which was that the charge profile had moved into territory that carried different consequences, not administrative, not civil, but criminal in a way that was not going to be managed with lawyers and delayed proceedings, and the particular institutional softening that money and connection sometimes produced. "Why are you showing me this?" she said. Reese looked at his hands. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was being honest rather than careful. "'Cause you were in that ER," he said, "and you made the call that kept him alive. And I thought you deserved to know why it mattered, beyond what you already knew." She looked at the beige wall. She looked at the box of tissues. She thought about 6 months of trying to disappear. She thought about the blank application and the storage unit and the folding cot and the deliberate architecture of a life made as small and quiet as she could make it, and how none of it had worked, and how the not working had not been failure but something else, something she was still finding the right word for. "Okay," she said. She pushed the tablet back across the table. "Okay," she said again, to herself this time. She stood up. "Thank you, Reese." He nodded. She walked out. The next 6 weeks were not smooth. Nothing about the process was smooth, and she had not expected it to be. And that expectation, or rather the absence of a naive opposite expectation, was probably the thing that kept her functional through it. The IG audit team arrived on Monday, as scheduled, and stayed for 11 days. They occupied the administrative conference room and a temporary space on the second floor and moved through the hospital's records with the methodical patience of people who had done this before and understood that the truth was almost always in the pattern rather than in any single document. She was interviewed 4 times. She gave the same account each time because it was the same account. There was only one version of what she had observed and documented and why, and it did not require memory management, which was the specific benefit of having been honest from the beginning. Pitts was formally charged on day 9 of the audit. The charges included procurement fraud, criminal healthcare negligence, and federal healthcare negligence and federal conspiracy, the last connected to the aviation incident, which had its own interests running parallel and occasionally intersecting with the OIG work. His lawyer released a statement that the charges were politically motivated and factually unsupported. The statement was 3 paragraphs long and contained no specific factual rebuttal of any documented allegation, which told her everything she needed to know about how his defense was going to proceed. Drayton's situation moved on a different track and at a different speed. The nursing board completed its expedited character review in 3 weeks rather than the standard 8, given the unusual circumstances and the weight of documentation. The conclusion communicated to her in a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning while she was drinking coffee and looking at the plant, which still needed no intervention, was that the complaint filed against her was dismissed in its entirety. The procedures she had performed on the night of April 24th were found to be within the scope of her federal emergency independent duty certification. The board noted, in language that was careful but not ambiguous, that the complaint itself appeared to have been filed in a context of documented institutional conflict of interest, and that this context had been considered in the review. The letter was 4 pages. She read it once. She put it in the drawer with the second notebook. Drayton's own board process was separate and did not move as quickly. Because his case involved multiple complaint threads, the clinical misconduct allegations from her documentation, the email chain establishing his deliberate strategy to discredit her, and the co-signed procurement documents. The state medical board did not move fast by design. But it moved, and she had learned years ago that things moving in the right direction at the right speed mattered more than things moving fast. His clinical privileges at Harlow General were permanently revoked. This happened before the board process concluded, through the hospital's own credentialing review, which had the authority to act independently of the board, and which did. His name came off the door of the ER chief's office on a Thursday afternoon. She was on shift when it happened, and she heard about it from Garrett, who had seen the facilities team doing it, who had the expression of someone reporting a fact that felt larger than a fact. She did not go look. She had Bay 4 to manage and a patient whose blood pressure was doing something it shouldn't, and that was more immediate and more important than a name being removed from a door. Sylvia Park asked to meet with her in the 3rd week of May. Not the conference room this time. Park's own office, which was smaller and had a window that faced the parking structure, which was not a great view but was at least a view. Park had coffee ready, which was which was an adjustment from the PowerPoint lighting and the formal seating and the careful administrative language of the previous meetings. She sat down. Park sat across from her. The board wants to discuss the interim ER leadership structure, Park said, while the credentialing and hiring process runs for a permanent chief. She paused. Your name has come up, Mara looked at her. As interim, Park said. Not permanent. The permanent hire will go through a full search, but interim to stabilize the department during the transition. I'm a nurse. You are, Park said. You are also the person who identified the primary clinical deficiencies in this department and documented them with more precision than 3 years of internal reviews managed to produce. You are the person who kept a general alive. You are the person that every nurse on this floor and several physicians have told the board they trust. She stopped. I'm not asking you to practice medicine. I'm asking you to run the department while we find the right person to lead it long term. Operational oversight, protocol review, staff coordination. Mara thought about it. I'll need full access to the complaint and incident record, she said. Everything that was filed and buried. I want to know what was ignored and when. That's reasonable. And the supply chain. I want the new vendor contracts reviewed before they're signed. Also reasonable. And Dr. Patel gets a formal recognition of his conduct during the crash response. It should be in his personnel file, not just verbal. Park looked at her for a moment. That's not usually part of this kind of conversation, she said. No, Mara agreed. But he made the right calls under significant institutional pressure, and nobody has formally acknowledged that. It matters. Park was quiet. All right, she said. Mara looked at the window. The parking structure was not, in fact, a great view. But the light coming over it was fine. Interim, she said. Until the permanent hire. Yes. And I keep my patient care role. I'm not leaving the floor entirely. Park raised an eyebrow. Most people would consider that optional given it's not optional for me. Park looked at her. Then she nodded. Then yes, she said. All of it. The formal nursing board clearance letter was published as a matter of public record in the second week of June, because nursing board proceedings in the state were public record, and Drayton's lawyer had made the original complaint public in what had clearly been intended as a reputational move, which meant the dismissal was equally public. 3 local news outlets covered it. She did not read any of them. Adeyemi read one and told her the coverage was accurate but missing most of what actually mattered, which she had expected. Katie was discharged from the hospital on the last day of May, 6 weeks after the crash. He walked out on his own feet, which Arnstein had described as characteristic and only mildly ahead of schedule. He stopped at the ER on his way out. She was at the nurse's station. He came through the department in civilian clothes, with Reese 2 steps behind, and the particular post-surgery quality of a body that was working again but knew what it had been through. He moved a little more carefully than before, a little more deliberately, and she thought that was probably not just the healing, but the knowledge that came with it, the changed relationship a person had with their own body after it had nearly stopped. He walked to her. Around them, the ER did what it did the monitors, the motion, the ordinary constant work. A few people noticed. Most were busy. He stopped in front of her. "How's the department?" he said. "Better," she said. Slowly. "The program proposal went to final approval this morning," he said. "The joint training curriculum. Medical Command has assigned a liaison office. We have a budget and a timeline. I heard. Director Marsh says you've already sent her a 40-page curriculum outline." 43 pages, she said. "The last 3 are appendices." Something in his face shifted the expression of a man who had spent his career surrounded by people, who did things the way they were supposed to be done, and who recognized it clearly when he saw it. "Mara," he said. She looked at him. "I'm going to say this once," he said, "and you can do whatever you want with it." He paused. The department moved around them, indifferent and constant. The way you have been treated in this building, the way you were managed, documented, and deliberately undermined by people who were afraid of what you knew, that was wrong. It was wrong in ways that had consequences beyond you, and it should not have taken an aircraft and a federal investigation for it to be corrected. She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "I don't want you to just know it," he said. "I want you to know that the people responsible for it are being held accountable in ways that will last. Pitts will face criminal charges. Drayton's board process will conclude in findings that are permanent. The patients who were harmed by the triage irregularities have legal recourse. None of this undoes what it cost you." He paused. "But it happened. It's on the record. That matters." She thought about 6 months of eating alone in a diner booth. She thought about the changed break schedules and the averted eyes and the formal warning in her file for identifying a tension pneumothorax correctly. She thought about the specific weight of being right in a room full of people who had decided not to see it, and how that weight did not go away when the room finally came around, how it just became something you carried differently. It matters, she said, and she meant it. Not as performance, not as reassurance, but as the honest truth that consequences were not nothing, that accountability was not nothing, that the record was not nothing even when it arrived imperfectly and late. He put out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm. She remembered that from the field, handshakes of a man who meant them. Major Sloane, he said. She had not yet gotten used to the title. She wasn't sure she would, entirely. The commission reinstatement had come through in writing 10 days earlier, and it sat on her 10 days earlier, and next at her kitchen table next to the nursing board clearance letter in a stack of documents that she had not yet found the right place to put away, because putting them away required deciding what they were past or present, or some third thing she didn't have a word for yet. General, she said. He left. Reese paused on his way past and said nothing, just made brief eye contact with the small nod she had come to recognize as his version of everything that didn't need to be said out loud. She gave it back. Then it was just the ER again. She stayed late that night, not because she had to, but because the department felt different, in the after-shifted change when it was just the incoming team and the patients and the ordinary ongoing business of emergencies medicine, and she wanted to be in it without anything else attached. She walked the floor. She walked Bay 1 through Bay 6, the way she had walked it in her first weeks on the night Schnaumuff, when she had been learning the shape of this place, cataloging its quirks and its failures and its correctable problems. She walked it differently now, not with the low profile of someone trying to be unnoticed, not with the exhausted caution, not someone counting months on a self-imposed calendar. Just walking it the way you walked a space you were responsible for and intended to improve. Bay 3 still had the suction unit that needed a hard reset. She'd put in the maintenance request 3 days ago, and it was scheduled for next week. Bay 2 had a new monitor, correctly calibrated. The crash cart near the nurse's station had a defibrillator that no longer sounded uncertain because she had requested a replacement in her first week of interim oversight. And the request had, for the first time in her 6 months at this hospital, actually moved through the system. Small things, correctable things. The kind that nobody wrote about and nobody celebrated, but that were the actual difference between a department that worked and one that didn't. She stopped at the window at the end of the hall. The city was out there, doing what it always did. The lights, the motion, the indifferent constant living of a place that did not know or care what had happened inside this building over the last 6 weeks, which was fine. That was how it was supposed to be. The city's job was not to watch. The hospital's job was to be there when the city needed it, and the department's job was to be ready, and her job for now, for this particular chapter of a life that had taken more shapes than she had planned, was to make sure it was. She thought about the people she had not been able to save. She thought about them regularly. She always would. There was a name for the list she carried. She knew the clinical terminology, the diagnostic language for how that kind of loss lodged itself and what it did over time. But what she mostly knew was that the list was real and that carrying it was part of the work and that the way you carried it mattered. You could carry it alone, which she had done for 3 years, which worked until it didn't. Or you could carry it in a building full of people who were doing the same work, sharing the same impossible daily task of standing between people and the worst outcomes, who understood, without needing it explained, what it cost and what it was worth. She had not expected, 6 months ago, standing in an HR office with a blank application, to find that here. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking to stop. But she had not stopped. She had never been capable of stopping. And that, she thought while looking at the city through the window, feeling the specific ache of the old injury in the cold air, hearing the ordinary sounds of the department at work behind her, that was not a flaw. That had never been a flaw. That was the thing that had looked like a wound for so long that she had stopped distinguishing between the two. She turned around. Adeyemi was at the nurse's station, reviewing charts with the focused expression of a doctor who was becoming, shift by shift, more than his training. Garrett was restocking the supply cart with the particular, methodical care of someone who had decided that the details mattered. The incoming nurses were moving through the floor with the rhythm of people who had started very slowly and very imperfectly to trust the place they were working. Not smooth, not finished, not any kind of ideal version of what a department should be, but better, measurably, documentably better. And that was enough. That was the work. She walked back to the nurse's station. She picked up a chart. She looked at the patient name, the presenting complaint, the triage timestamp. She started reading. Her limp was still there. It always would be. The shrapnel that the surgeons had left in place was still there, 4 centimeters from a nerve, making itself known in cold weather and long shifts and the quiet moments when she stood still long enough to feel it. The scars were still there. The names on the list she carried were still there. The 3 years of trying to make herself small enough to disappear had left their own mark, a kind wariness that did not go away because the circumstances that had produced it were resolved that was not how people worked, and she had long since stopped expecting herself to work that way. But she was not disappearing anymore. She was not disappearing anymore. She was standing in the middle of a department she was building into something worth standing in, with people around her who had finally, imperfectly, started to see her clearly. She was holding a commission she had earned and nearly lost and earned again. She was about to build a curriculum that would carry what she knew into the hands of people who would use it in conditions she would never see, on patients she would never meet, in emergencies that hadn't happened yet. She was not surviving anymore. She was doing what she had always done, which was the work, but doing it now with people beside her instead of despite them, and with the full weight of who she was on the table instead of locked in a blank section of an application form. The monitor in Bay 2 alarmed. She was already moving. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. The alarm, the movement, the decision made in the narrow space between what was happening and what needed to happen next. The years of practice that lived in her hands and her eyes, and the part of her that never fully rested. The knowledge that none of it was guaranteed, that patients were lost, and systems failed, and people made wrong calls in high-stakes moments, despite everything, but that the alternative to trying was not an option, had never been an option, would never be an option for someone built the way she was built. She came through the bay door. The nurse looked up. And this time, as it had been now for 3 weeks, as she was slowly learning to receive, without bracing for it to be taken back, the nurse did not look past her, did not look over her shoulder, did not wait for someone with a different title to fill the space she was already filling. She looked at Mara, and Mara looked back, and she got to work.